saw stories about people getting snatched out of their beds and blindfolded. I know that I felt scammed eating donated and often expired food. I was to keep my little mouth shut. My parents didn't make jack shit. The amount of inappropriate encounters I had. So I have recently come to the realization, slash, I guess, started to accept that for a little over 2.5 years of my life, I lived in what I now consider almost definitely a cult. And I was talking to some girls about it over the weekend, but I was out for my birthday and I was kind of like, ooh, this is entering major bummer territory, so I don't really want to talk about it right now. But also the truth of the matter is that ever since these dots have kind of all started connecting for me, I have been wanting to talk about it all. And since my therapist is still on maternity leave, here I am, and we're gonna talk about what I would definitely call a cult that I lived in for 2 years in middle school. So for most of my younger childhood, I went to a pretty just standard non-denominational Christian church. It was very welcoming, very moderate, nothing crazy. And then when I was in later elementary school, my parents started taking us to this Pentecostal church that was an Assemblies of God church. Now, I'm not trying to attack anyone's beliefs, so I'm not gonna say that this church itself was inherently the problem, although I absolutely do think that a lot of the teachings and doctrines, while they may not have explicitly told people to isolate themselves, if nothing else, there was kind of the suggestion that you ultimately shouldn't associate closely with anyone who doesn't share your religious beliefs. This church also had what I would definitely consider to be a charismatic leader. Like I said, I can't generalize about all Assemblies of God churches, but the specific church I went to absolutely had a leader that had way too much undue influence over at least certain members of the congregation's lives. And my family fell into that group, which I'll get into. My parents are really musical and both really talented, so they both quickly became involved in the music and worship team at that church, and pretty soon they were in charge of it. And at that church, being in charge of the music was almost like being a lower level pastor. They were essentially considered like some level of church leaders, and once that started, their relationship with our church pastor got kind of weird. It definitely felt like once they were in a higher position with the church, they kind of had to do what he said. And it wasn't just faith-based stuff. This guy was really too involved in our lives and general decision-making. Another overtly weird thing about this church is that it had a really close relationship with a faith-based rehab group, kind of in the area, but like almost an hour away from the actual church. I know I named Assemblies of God by name, but that doesn't tell you the exact church, and I'm not going to tell you what faith-based rehab this is because I don't want to get in trouble, but also it's not rocket science, you can figure it out. This was a faith-based rehabilitation center that serviced both teens and adults. A lot of the centers for teenagers are located overseas, sketchy. And the specific center that had a really close affiliation with this church we were going to served adult men. The guys going through this faith-based rehab program had to go to our church every Sunday. They got bussed in by the program itself. It wasn't an option. And we all knew these guys. We'd shake their hands in church. There was nothing like weird about the fact that they were going through rehab and they were going to our church. But to me, in retrospect, it is very weird that we're making these guys going through rehab go to a specific church that is a very specific, very fundamentalist evangelical ideology. It's like out there for Christianity. If you're not familiar with the Pentecostal sect of the Christian church, there is a heavy emphasis on Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, and the end times and the book of Revelation. So big doomsday stuff. Lots of kind of extreme fundamentalist belief. Depending on the Pentecostal church, some of them are really strict about women wearing like long skirts, not cutting their hair. The specific church I went to wasn't like that, but modest dress. Modesty was such a big thing, which I'll get into more. Part of what's also interesting about this faith-based rehab, especially in its connection to this specific church, is there's a lot of nepotism going on. So for example, the pastor of the church I was attending was also the regional director for the entire Midwest of this rehabilitation program. maybe some conflict of interest there. And in addition to that, the center that was busing their clients to our church every Sunday was run by his children. Specifically, his son was the director of the program, but he also had other children in high power positions there. At some point after we had been at this church for a while, my stepdad was offered a position working at this faith-based rehab. They wanted him to come on as their worship pastor. What that would mean for our family is moving onto the actual facility itself. And what that looked like when we got there was essentially that there was this giant complex that everyone actually going through the rehab program lived at, and then all of the staff lived on houses that were just outside and like kind of up a little road a ways, but still on the same property. All of the staff and their kids lived in these houses that were just like a little ways away, and they were duplexes, so all of your like next door neighbors were other people working there. It was, for all intents and purposes, a commune. So when my parents had told me that they accepted this position and we were going to be moving there, I was really upset, because for me that meant moving from living in the city to almost an hour away to a much more rural community where I would essentially just be living with the people I went to church with. And I, at that age, was already super into music, super into theater, so I knew that I was basically going from having already very few opportunities to none. So I was heartbroken to be moving out there. When I got there, my tune did actually change a little, because the house we moved into, and this is the case for all of the staff's houses, the house was really nice. We were absolutely low income prior to this and during this whole time, so our house that we had moved out of was really small. I shared a bedroom with 2 other siblings. So being in this big, nice house that was bigger and nicer than anything I had ever lived in felt really, really cool and really special. And something I didn't even really consider until years later was the contrast between our living conditions and the living conditions of the people that were paying to go through this rehab. While I never personally saw inside these dorms, they were dorms for adult men, I was like an 11-year-old girl. That would have been the pinnacle of inappropriate things that happened there, and it didn't happen. But I did a lot of research when I kind of started connecting some dots here. And the consensus is that the people actually going through these programs live in what is at best like dorm style conditions, and at worst like prison style conditions. So in retrospect, the fact that we were put up in this honestly pretty cushy duplex while people paying to go through a really expensive rehab program were living in what was slightly better than prison cells feels really, really up to me. Ultimately, my parents worked there and we lived there for, I think, a little over 2.5, maybe closer to 3 years. And there was a lot about it that was weird. While our living conditions were really nice, my parents didn't make jack shit for money. And to be fair, this program is considered a nonprofit, but I would really love to get into the living standards of the guy who is the director for the Midwest here pretty soon. Not just to contrast it with the living conditions of the staff working there, but more so to contrast it with the living conditions of the people who were paying to go through this program. One example is that for the guys going through the program, they had to have all their meals together in this big kind of cafeteria style room. It had like round tables, not like long cafeteria tables, but it was like, you know, a big dining room where they all had to eat all of their meals together. The vast majority of the food that was cooked and served would be donations from the food pantry, and it was not at all uncommon for that food to be expired. In addition to the guys who, again, either they or their family was paying a lot of money for them to go through this rehab program. In addition to them eating meals that primarily consisted of food pantry donations that, again, not uncommon for the expired, it was also understood that staff and their families, in order to demonstrate an example of healthy family life, we should go eat with these guys in this cafeteria at their little compound thing at least once or twice a week. And the reality is that since my family was getting paid such money to actually do their jobs there, we ate there a lot because it was free and it was what we could afford. So you've got the clients eating donated and often expired food, and in addition to that, you've got the staff and their children coming to eat donated, sometimes expired food with the guys going through the program. Part of what was also really weird about living there as an 11, 12, 13-year-old girl is that I was kind of constantly being made to feel like I was a temptation to these grown-ass men, like 20 plus. If we were going to go down to the center to eat a meal, it was really important that I was wearing something super, super modest. My parents would jump down my throat if I had on something like a little tight, a little skin showing. I became so hyper conscious of every minuscule piece of flesh that showed, or how even remotely tight something was on my body, because I was being told that I'd be ogled. I was basically trained as an 11, 12-year-old to expect that men are looking at me in that way, and it is my responsibility to cover up. And to be totally honest, the amount of inappropriate encounters I had while I was living there and left unattended as a child at the actual center, whether it be waiting for a parent, waiting for a meal, waiting for some activity or something, just like sitting in the lobby alone, and some like 25-year-old, 30-year-old guy would come up to me as a 12-year-old and ask me what year in college I was. I was 12. You know I'm not in college. And nothing about this felt like flattering or affirming, especially because I was developing so rapidly at that age and more than a lot of girls around me. I felt so hyper conscious of my body and so ashamed of it, and genuinely like scared of what it would do to me, or what consequences I would suffer from like having boobs. I did actually develop a pretty gnarly eating disorder in my time there, and I think looking back, it was probably a combination of horrible, often expired food that I had to eat in a really uncomfortable environment, but also genuine fear about my developing body and what repercussions getting curvier, getting more womanly, what that would mean for me, what danger that would put me in. Another really weird thing about my time there is, similarly to how they wanted the staff members and their families to come and eat meals at the center with the guys going through the program, I think it was once a month, they would have a small group of guys going through the program come over to your house as a staff member and the staff member's family. And again, all in the name of mirroring positive, healthy family dynamics, which don't even get me started on how ironic that is. They would have the guys come over for like a game night. So these men who lived feet away from my home that I already felt wildly uncomfortable around are now in my home. Even though I understand my parents were there, it was all like supervised group activity, I still just felt uncomfortable having these people in my home. And for the record, it has nothing to do with what they were there for. It's not about like having an addict in my home. It's about having strange adult men in my home that I don't know. And beyond that, they did the housework and the property work for all of the staff. So if something needed fixed in the house, one of the guys from the center was gonna come do it. If our yard needed mowed, someone from the center was in our yard mowing. Like, just in retrospect, the level of access that these men had to me as a child and other staff members' children is just deeply unsettling. Now, one thing I cannot speak to, I don't know if they background checked these guys before enrolling them, I don't know that, but regardless, I know that I felt scared. Another thing about this organization that I find really strange and manipulative, and that I think is a big part of what makes it a cult, is how they get people enrolled to go through this program. So for the teens, it's kind of your classic teen rehab thing. I saw stories about people getting snatched out of their beds and blindfolded, and classic bad teen reform program stuff. For the adults, it was a little different. A lot of the people we had in there were court ordered to be there. So they were there going through the program as an alternative to serving jail time. If that isn't preying on a vulnerable community, I don't know what is. I mean, it's taking people who are struggling with legitimate addictions that frankly our system is already just doing a job of dealing with if their answer to that is throw them in jail. But you take those people who are in probably the most vulnerable position they're ever going to be in their life, and you offer them this alternative to it that will completely control and derail their life and cost them a lot of money. But also, like, who can say no to it, because it's that or jail. Also, for that reason, I remember it being drilled into me I was never to discuss any of the people going through that program with anyone outside of it. And that included police officers. I was distinctly told by my parents that if a police officer ever asked me about a specific person going through the program, hey, is so-and-so here? Have you seen so-and-so around? I was to keep my little mouth shut. And even as a paralegal, I don't know, I haven't fully dived into like the legal reasons behind that, the legality of that, but what I know for a fact is that it's really sketchy. So you get these guys here to go through this program based on pretty manipulative tactics, and then no one's allowed to talk about them. And while I know that it was painted in this way that's like, well, we don't want them getting in trouble, we don't want them getting hauled out of here and taken to jail when they should be getting treatment. But in retrospect, what I really think it had a lot to do with is that people aren't checking up on these guys. People who aren't their immediate family who put them in there can't really gauge their welfare while they're in there. And back to their affiliation with the specific church and why that is weird and problematic. So like I said, the pastor of this church is the regional director for this entire rehab facility. He is in charge of all of the locations in the Midwest. The reason I describe him as a charismatic leader, specifically with regards to the intersection of this church and this program, is that he was a former addict. And he would get up, maybe not every Sunday morning, but it was a frequent topic of discussion. He'd get up there and essentially give us his testimony. And it was always about his recovery from addiction. And it was very dramatic. I will give him that he's an incredibly talented orator, but the whole spiel kind of presents this idea that this is how I got clean, this changed my life, and like, I can and will do the same for you. This will work for you. And because these people are going through this program where they are literally forced to go listen to him every week, that is just getting drilled into their heads over and over again that like, this guy did it this way, he's got the answer, this is the answer for you, this has to work for you. And so if it doesn't work for you, there's probably something wrong with you. And in addition to that, he had so much power over people who were really involved with the church because a lot of them were also involved with this organization. So like, now he's not just in charge of my parents as their pastor, he also has control over their employment and livelihood. And that is not a normal level of influence for a pastor to have over his congregation. And I'm not saying that everyone who went to this church worked for this organization, but there was a concerning level of overlap where I don't know that I would say he was a cult leader to the general church, but he was a cult leader within this organization and in the ways that it intersected with this church. Additionally, while we're eating, potentially expired food pantry donations and getting paid so little that, we're all wearing each other's communal hand-me-downs and stuff, this man lives in a little mini mansion with a hot tub and a pool, and he's always going on trips. And I just want to remind you, this is a nonprofit. This is a nonprofit, which is why we're getting paid so little and why we're happy to get paid so little, because we're doing a good thing, we're helping a broader purpose here. But tell me why a man has a hot tub when the people who built that empire for him are eating expired food and living in a slight upgrade from a prison cell. I think one of the things I find in retrospect that just really didn't even occur to me at the time that I now think is most problematic about this organization. This was a rehab facility and they treated all kinds of addiction, gambling, porn, alcohol, opiates, and they treated them all the same. The way the guys come into the program is that they would do a 3-day detox at a medical facility, at a hospital, somewhere nearby, but from there they came to us. We didn't have a doctor on staff, we didn't have a nurse on staff, we didn't have a psychiatrist on staff. So these guys are coming from a medical environment where they're detoxing from whatever they're detoxing from for maybe 3 days, and then they come to this facility where their only support is Jesus and the Bible and prayer. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I think a lot of these guys had genuine, treatable, diagnosable mental issues, and had they received actual psychiatric trained medical care, I just think that their families would have been much better off spending a whole bunch of money on that than what was a glorified prayer prison. And that brings me to the alleged success rate of this program, because for me, the success rate was what justified everything for a long time. Like, I remember being there and thinking, this is weird, and afterwards thinking, that was a weird time. But I was always told that their success rate was like upwards of 80%. I want to say like somewhere between 80 and 90%. And if you know anything about rehabilitation programs, addiction programs, that's unheard of almost. Those are crazy success rates, and for a long time, that was, the proof in the pudding to me. But what I've realized in doing some research is that much like a lot of other cult-like groups, that their claim to fame is that they're really good at curing addiction, Scientology, it's not really true. There's a lot of research indicating that their success rates have been misreported, that the studies to determine their success rates are not scientifically sound. They're not following up with people far enough out to actually really claim that they're still successful after going through this program. So what's the actual success rate? I don't really know, because they're bending over backwards to make it look better than it is. What I can say is that I personally, over the 2.5, 3 years I lived there, saw a lot of people relapse. What's really sad for me is that, from my recollection, most of those people were people who struggled with opioid addictions. And I just think that it's such a fallacy to believe that you can treat a chemical addiction like that, like something that changes the way your brain functions through prayer and belief in God, and then basically convince people that they're not working hard enough, they're not doing something right, there's something wrong with them. If that doesn't work for them, it's not going to work for them. I know of people who were going through the program when I was there who have died or relapsed horribly, but you would never hear about that from this organization. They would lead you to believe that everyone who comes out of their doors is treated and cured and will never relapse and never struggle with addiction because they found their peace in God, and that's all anybody needs. It's just so sad when you think about some of these people that needed genuine medical and psychological care and support, and what they got was religious bullshit. And people like my stepdad helping them, who is himself a narcissistic cult leader wannabe. And I do have to throw out the caveat, my own uncle went through this program. He's passed away since from totally unrelated causes. But, to the best of my knowledge, he was successful coming out of it. I'm not trying to say it doesn't work for anyone, but he was already an incredibly religious person that believed everything this program believed, and he didn't have to be indoctrinated. And it wasn't necessarily abusive for him because of that. But I think even in retrospect, my parents would probably look back and say that there were significant abuses of power. They would probably downplay them and kind of minimize them because they don't want to turn fully away from what still is their ideological and religious kind of fundamental belief system. But they would absolutely acknowledge that some of the individuals in power there abused it. I think when I look back at what was kind of the most damaging for me living there, it probably has a lot to do with just sort of the inherent sense of shame and fear that I was led to develop about my own body and its development and what it looked like, and that led to years of being hypervigilant about my body, what I was wearing, just a whole bunch of issues. And later on the line, I definitely tried to overcome some of those issues in ways that were counterproductive, and it's just like a whole journey that, everyone has issues with their body, but it's a very specific kind of fear to like walk into a group of men for dinner before your middle school band concert and be afraid about what's gonna happen because the band concert dress you're wearing is maybe a little more low cut than what you would normally wear to dinner with a bunch of strange old men. And I just think that that's not a journey anyone should have to have. The camera died, so we're down here now. But beyond that, I think what was really damaging about kind of being indoctrinated into this whole belief system where faith is really the end-all be-all and should solve all your problems, should be the solution to everything. Like, as a legally blind kid, I can't count the number of times I got pulled into a circle of people where everyone was supposed to put hands on me, and then this charismatic leader would pray with everyone for the Lord to heal my blindness, restore my eyesight, take all my ailments away. And the level of pain, and honestly, soul-crushing pain that I would feel every time I left that prayer circle, every bit as blind as I was when I went in. And then, also internalizing that in some way that it is my fault that I'm still blind, that if I had stronger faith or was more moral or tried harder to follow the rules, then I'd be healed. So, it is somehow my fault that I haven't been. And I absolutely don't believe that now, but it doesn't change the fact that that was very painful, and that is absolutely still pain that lingers. And it just gives me some very small shred of the feeling that you know, these people must have experienced, if they were going through this program and struggling with something, they needed genuine help for, they needed medical help for. And even then, addiction is hard. Addiction is a long road for a lot of people. And so to kind of convince these people who are in such a vulnerable spot, going on such a hard road, that if it's not working for them, it's their fault. They don't believe enough. It's just so sad to me. And as much as I have wounds from my experience, I definitely still believe that the people who went through the most were the people who actually went through that program, and their families, and, you know, more than anyone, the teens that went through that program. When I was doing research, I mean, the stories from the teen centers are harrowing. It's really sad. So there's, you know, a lot more to the story. There was cult hopping afterwards. There was my stepdad trying and failing to create his own cult. It derailed life for a while. It made things weird for a while, and I'm still definitely, I'm only realizing that I'm still kind of picking up the pieces. There are a lot of things I have struggled with internally through the years that I am starting to realize have at least some of their roots in that period of my life that I used to just think of as a weird fever dream. And I know I'm not the person or even one of the people who suffered the most at the hands of this organization. But that being said, it still did a lot of damage. So I can only imagine how much damage it did for those people. So I don't know, I just want to say thank you for listening if you listened, and an even bigger thank you to the people in my actual real life who have given me space to kind of talk about this and process it with them, because like I said, I'm still very much kind of processing all of this, but thank you for letting me process it in your face. And if you are familiar with the church I'm referring to, or the faith-based rehab, feel more than free to reach out to me and tell me about your experience. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do, obviously, but I know part of what has been helping me process all of this has been reading other people's stories, reaching out to people, and just generally trying to connect with people who have similar experiences. So even if you just have a remotely similar experience, and if you feel like it would do you any good to share it with someone, get it off your chest, I'm all ears. Feel free to reach out to me. But that is all. Okay, thank you. Bye.